He froze when the barefoot twins clutched the coin and whispered, "Thank you, sir, for Mommy's photo." His entire world shattered in that moment. Life has a way of revealing our deepest secrets when we least expect it. For Maxwell Grant, a self-made millionaire with properties across 3 continents, that moment came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in the downtown area he rarely visited. What began as a simple act of charity, giving a coin to 2 small barefoot children, turned into the revelation that would change everything he thought he knew about his past. Those innocent eyes looked so familiar, and when they mentioned the man from the photo, Maxwell's perfectly constructed reality began to crumble beneath his designer shoes. What happened next wasn't just shocking. It was the beginning of a journey that would heal wounds he didn't even know existed. It was supposed to be a quick detour for Maxwell, just a brief stop before his meeting with potential investors. His chauffeur had taken a wrong turn into the poorer district of the city, an area Maxwell hadn't visited in over 15 years. Looking out through the tinted windows of his luxury car, he noticed 2 small children sitting on the sidewalk, their clothes tattered and their feet bare despite the autumn chill. Something about them caught his attention. Perhaps it was the way they huddled together, protecting each other from the world. Their faces, though smudged with dirt, held an unmistakable dignity that resonated with him on a level he couldn't quite understand. "Stop the car," Maxwell commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being obeyed without question. The chauffeur quickly pulled over, surprised by the unexpected instruction. Maxwell rarely interacted with strangers, especially in neighborhoods like this. His assistant, sitting beside him, raised an eyebrow but remained silent as Maxwell reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He wasn't sure why he felt compelled to help these particular children when he passed dozens of others in need every day. Perhaps it was their quiet determination, or perhaps it was something else, something he couldn't yet name. Maxwell stepped out of the car, ignoring his assistant's warnings about being late for the meeting. The cool air hit his face as he approached the children, twins he could now see clearly. A boy and a girl, no older than 7, with identical chocolate brown eyes that widened in surprise as the well-dressed man approached them. Maxwell noticed how they instinctively moved closer together, the boy slightly in front of his sister in a protective stance. It reminded him of himself as a child, always ready to defend those he loved. He smiled, hoping to ease their obvious fear of this stranger in an expensive suit coming their way. "Hello there," Maxwell said softly, kneeling down despite the risk to his tailored pants. He wanted to be at eye level with the children, to show them respect rather than charity. The twins watched him warily, their expressions a mixture of hope and suspicion that broke something inside Maxwell's carefully guarded heart. These children had clearly learned early that the world wasn't always kind to those without resources. "I thought you might be hungry," he continued, holding out not just a coin but a $50 bill. It was more than he'd planned to give, but something about these children moved him deeply. The twins stared at the money with wide eyes, clearly unaccustomed to such generosity. The girl, slightly smaller than her brother but with the same determined expression, hesitantly reached out. Her tiny hand trembled as she took the bill, and that's when Maxwell noticed a small crescent-shaped birthmark on her wrist, identical to one his sister had worn. His breath caught in his throat, a strange uneasiness settling over him. The coincidence was unsettling, but surely that's all it was. After all, birthmarks weren't uncommon, and the shape was simple enough to appear on many people. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something hauntingly familiar about these children. "Thank you, sir," the boy said, his voice surprisingly clear and well-spoken for a child living on the streets. The girl nodded, clutching the money tightly as if afraid it might disappear. Maxwell smiled again, about to stand up and return to his waiting car when the girl suddenly tilted her head, studying his face with an intensity that seemed beyond her years. Recognition flickered in her eyes, though Maxwell was certain they'd never met before. He would have remembered these children, with their matching faces and resilient spirits. Then the girl whispered something to her brother, who looked back at Maxwell with newfound interest. "You're the man from Mommy's photo," the boy stated matter-of-factly, with the innocent certainty that only children possess. The words hit Maxwell like a physical blow, leaving him momentarily speechless. His mind raced through possibilities. Perhaps he resembled someone they knew, or maybe his face had appeared in some advertisement they'd seen. But deep down, an uncomfortable truth was beginning to form, one he wasn't ready to acknowledge. Maxwell had never married, had always been too focused on building his empire to consider a family. Yet here were these children, claiming to recognize him from their mother's photograph. What photo? Maxwell finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. The twins exchanged glances, having one of those silent conversations that only twins can have. The girl reached into a small, worn backpack and pulled out a crumpled photograph protected in a plastic bag. With hesitant hands, she offered it to Maxwell, who took it with fingers that had suddenly gone numb. Smoothing out the creases, he found himself staring at a younger version of himself, arm wrapped around a woman he'd tried desperately to forget for 15 years. Alexandra, his first love, the woman who disappeared without explanation, leaving nothing but a brief note saying she needed to find herself. Maxwell's heart pounded painfully against his ribs as he looked from the photograph to the children's faces, seeing for the first time what should have been obvious from the start. They had his mother's eyes, her high cheekbones. The birthmark on the girl's wrist wasn't a coincidence. It was genetic, passed down through his family for generations. The world seemed to tilt beneath him as the implications crashed down. These weren't just any street children he'd felt mysteriously drawn to. They were his children. Children he never knew existed, living on the streets, begging for coins while he lived in luxury. The realization was devastating, filling him with equal parts wonder and horror. "Where is your mother?" he asked, his voice cracking with emotion he couldn't hide. The twins' expressions clouded, and Maxwell knew the answer before they spoke. The boy straightened his shoulders, taking on a responsibility no child should have to bear. "She's in the hospital," he said softly. "She's been sick for a long time. Today she's having a big operation, so we came to get money for food." The simple explanation, delivered with such stoic acceptance, shattered what remained of Maxwell's composure. While he'd been building skyscrapers and amassing wealth, the woman he'd once loved had been struggling, raising their children alone, now fighting for her life in some hospital while their children begged on the street. The world around Maxwell seemed to fade away. The luxury car, the waiting chauffeur, the important meeting. None of it mattered in the face of this revelation. He looked at the twins, really looked at them, and saw 7 years of birthdays he'd missed, first steps he hadn't witnessed, tears he hadn't wiped away. How had this happened? Why hadn't Alexandra told him about the pregnancy? The questions swirled in his mind, but he pushed them aside. There would be time for answers later. Right now, these children, his children, needed him, and their mother was in a hospital somewhere, fighting a battle Maxwell knew nothing about. "My name is Maxwell," he said gently, realizing the children might not even know who he was beyond being the man from the photo. "And I'd like to help you and your mother, if you'll let me." The twins exchanged another glance, performing that silent communication again. Maxwell wondered if he and Alexandra would have had that same connection if they'd grown up together. The thought sent a fresh wave of pain through him. All the moments lost, the bonds that should have formed. The boy nodded slowly, apparently having made a decision for both of them. "I'm Thomas," he said, "and this is Lily. Mom said if anything happened to her, we should find you." Maxwell's throat tightened. Alexandra had known she might not make it through the operation. She'd prepared the children, given them his photograph. But why now? Why after 7 years? The questions multiplied, but again, they would have to wait. "Which hospital is your mother in?" he asked, already standing and gesturing toward his car. The twins hesitated, clearly weighing the risks of going with a stranger, even one their mother had apparently designated as a safety net. Their caution spoke volumes about the life they'd lived, always needing to be careful, to protect themselves. It broke Maxwell's heart to think they'd grown up with such burdens. "St. Mary's," Lily finally answered, her voice softer than her brother's, but no less determined. "She's been there for 3 days. The doctor said she needs a special medicine, but it costs too much money. Maxwell's jaw clenched. Whatever Alexandra needed, he could provide it. Money was the one thing he had in abundance. The irony wasn't lost on him. All these years of building wealth, and he'd never known there were two small people in the world who actually needed it. He held out his hands to the twins, waiting patiently for them to decide whether to trust him. After what felt like an eternity, they each took one of his hands. Maxwell led them to the car, where his assistant's eyes widened in shock at the sight of the barefoot children. "Cancel all my meetings for today," Maxwell instructed, his tone leaving no room for argument, and called Dr. Reynolds. "Tell him to meet us at St. Mary's Hospital immediately." Dr. Reynolds was the best surgeon on Maxwell's payroll, the doctor who treated all his high-profile clients. If anyone could help Alexandra, it would be him. The twins climbed into the luxury car with wide eyes, clearly never having experienced such opulence. Maxwell noticed how they sat close together, drawing strength from each other. They had only each other to rely on for so long. The thought filled him with determination. From this moment forward, they would have him too. The ride to St. Mary's was filled with a tense silence, broken only by the twins' occasional whispers to each other. Maxwell wanted to ask them 1,000 questions about their lives, about Alexandra, about the years he'd missed, but he held back. There would be time for answers once he knew Alexandra was safe. Instead, he watched his newly discovered children, noting how Thomas kept a protective arm around his sister, how Lily's eyes darted nervously around the car's interior, taking in every detail. They were simultaneously awed by the luxury and suspicious of it, as if waiting for it to be snatched away. Their caution spoke of disappointments and broken promises, a childhood no child should experience. When they arrived at the hospital, Maxwell was struck by how ordinary it looked. He'd always imagined that life-changing moments happened in extraordinary settings, but this was just a standard hospital, its brick facade weathered by time and elements. The twins led the way with the confidence of children who'd made this journey many times before, navigating the sterile corridors with practiced ease. Maxwell followed, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. Each step brought him closer to Alexandra, the woman who'd once been his entire world, the woman who'd disappeared without explanation, the woman who'd raised his children without him. The pediatric ward was painted in cheerful colors that seemed at odds with the serious business of healing sick children. Nurses in patterned scrubs moved efficiently between rooms, some offering sympathetic smiles to the familiar twins. Maxwell realized with a pang that his children were well known here. They'd been visiting their mother through her illness, watching her fight a battle no child should have to witness. One nurse stopped them, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of Maxwell in his expensive suit, so obviously out of place in this world of modest means. "Thomas, Lily," she greeted warmly, then looked questioningly at Maxwell. "He's our dad," Thomas explained with simple directness that took Maxwell's breath away. The nurse's expression shifted from suspicion to surprise, then understanding. She nodded slowly, as if pieces of a puzzle were falling into place. "Room 215, she said softly. "The doctor just finished checking on her. The surgery is scheduled for this afternoon, but—" She trailed off, glancing at the twins before meeting Maxwell's eyes with a look that communicated what she wouldn't say in front of the children. The situation was serious, perhaps more serious than the twins fully understood. Maxwell thanked her with a nod and followed the children down the hall. Outside room 215, Maxwell paused. Beyond this door was the woman he'd once planned to spend his life with, the mother of his children, a person who'd become a stranger to him. The twins looked up at him expectantly, waiting for him to make the next move. Maxwell took a deep breath, steadying himself for whatever he might find inside. He pushed open the door gently, stepping into a small, private room filled with the soft beeping of monitors. And there she was, Alexandra, lying in the hospital bed, her once vibrant beauty now diminished by illness. She looked smaller somehow, frilier, but unmistakably the woman who'd captured his heart all those years ago. The woman who'd given him 2 children he never knew existed. Alexandra's eyes were closed when they entered, her breathing shallow but steady. The twins approached the bed with the quiet reverence children adopt in hospitals, understanding instinctively that this space demanded softness. "Mom," Lily whispered, reaching out to touch her mother's hand. "We brought someone." Alexandra's eyes fluttered open slowly, focusing first on her children with a smile that transformed her tired face. Then her gaze shifted beyond them, landing on Maxwell. For a moment, time seemed suspended as their eyes met across the years of separation. Recognition, shock, and something like relief washed over her features. "Maxwell," she breathed, his name sounding like both a question and an answer on her lips. The twins looked between their mother and the father they'd just met, sensing the weight of the moment even if they couldn't fully understand it. Maxwell stepped forward, his legs barely supporting him as emotions crashed through his carefully constructed defenses. There were so many things he wanted to say, accusations, questions, declarations, but they all dissolved at the sight of Alexandra's frail form in the hospital bed. Instead, he simply said, "I'm here now," words that contained both forgiveness and promise. Alexandra's eyes filled with tears as she reached for his hand. "I should have told you," she whispered, her voice weak but determined. "I've been trying to find the courage for years." Maxwell held her hand gently, aware of how fragile it felt in his. The anger he might have expected to feel was absent, replaced by an overwhelming need to understand, to make things right. The twins watched this exchange silently, their young faces solemn with the understanding that something important was happening. Thomas kept his arm around Lily, both children drawing strength from each other, as they always had. Maxwell marveled at their resilience, at how they'd survived circumstances that would break many adults. Alexandra's eyes drifted to her children, love shining through her exhaustion. "Thomas, Lily, could you please ask Nurse Claire for some water?" she asked gently. The twins nodded, understanding that the adults needed a moment alone. They slipped from the room quietly, casting curious glances back at Maxwell before the door closed behind them. In their absence, the room seemed suddenly smaller, the air charged with unspoken words. Alexandra struggled to sit up, and Maxwell moved instantly to help her, adjusting her pillows with a tenderness that surprised even him. Once settled, she looked at him directly, gathering her strength for what needed to be said. "I was scared," she began, the words clearly difficult to speak aloud after being held inside for so long. "When I found out I was pregnant, I was terrified. You were just starting your company, working 18-hour days, talking about changing the world. I knew what having a family would do to those dreams." Maxwell started to protest, but she shook her head gently, asking him to listen. "I convinced myself I was doing the right thing, that I was setting you free to become who you were meant to be. And then there were two of them, and everything was harder than I expected." She paused, catching her breath, the effort of speaking clearly taxing her limited strength. "I've regretted it every day since, but I was too proud to come back, too ashamed to admit I was wrong." Maxwell sat carefully on the edge of the bed, his mind reeling with Alexandra's revelations. For 15 years, he believed she'd left because she didn't love him enough, because his ambition had driven her away. The truth, that she'd left to protect those ambitions, was both beautiful and devastating in its misguided sacrifice. "You should have let me choose," he said softly, without accusation. "We could have figured it out together." Alexandra nodded, tears tracking silently down her cheeks. Maxwell gently wiped them away, the gesture bridging years of separation in an instant. The door opened, and the twins returned with a nurse who carried a pitcher of water. The nurse checked Alexandra's vitals, her expression professionally neutral, but her movements efficient with concern. "Dr. Williamson will be in shortly to discuss the surgery," she informed them before leaving. Maxwell exchanged glances with Alexandra, a silent understanding passing between them. Whatever was happening now, they would face it together. The twins settled into chairs beside the bed, watching the adults with the careful attention of children who've learned to read every nuance, every unspoken word. Maxwell realized they must have developed this skill out of necessity, needing to gauge their mother's health by subtle signs when she tried to hide her pain from them. "I made some calls," Maxwell said, addressing both Alexandra and the twins. "A specialist is on his way. Dr. Reynolds is the best surgeon in the country for this kind of procedure." He deliberately kept his words vague, unsure how much the children knew about their mother's condition. Alexandra's eyes widened slightly, hope flickering across her face before she tamped it down, clearly accustomed to not getting her hopes up. "Maxwell, those specialists cost," she began, but he cut her off gently. "Money is not an issue, Alexandra. Not anymore. Not ever again." The words hung in the air between them, a promise that extended beyond medical care to a future Maxwell was already beginning to envision. The door opened again, and a doctor entered, his white coat crisp, his manner businesslike but kind. He introduced himself as Dr. Williamson and seemed surprised to find Maxwell there. Alexandra explained simply that he was the twins' father, a statement that still sent a shock through Maxwell each time he heard it. Dr. Williamson nodded, accepting this new development without comment, and proceeded to explain Alexandra's condition. Maxwell listened with growing horror as he detailed the aggressive cancer that had spread from her pancreas, the experimental surgery that offered a slim chance of recovery, the prohibitive cost that had limited their options until now. Maxwell interrupted only once, to confirm that everything possible would be done regardless of expense. When Dr. Williamson left, promising to coordinate with the arriving specialist, a heavy silence filled the room. The twins had listened to the doctor's explanation with the stoic acceptance of children who've grown up too quickly, but Maxwell could see the fear behind their brave faces. He knelt before them, looking into eyes so like his own that he wondered how he hadn't seen the connection immediately. "I promise you both," he said with quiet intensity, "that I will do everything in my power to help your mother. And no matter what happens, you will never be alone again." The twins looked at him with cautious hope, not quite ready to believe that their lives could change so dramatically in a single afternoon, but wanting desperately to trust this man who was their father. Hours passed in a blur of medical consultations, paperwork, and hushed conversations in hospital corridors. Dr. Reynolds arrived as promised, bringing with him a team of specialists and equipment not normally available at St. Mary's. Maxwell watched from the sidelines as Alexandra was prepared for surgery, his newfound children standing close on either side of him. He'd never felt more helpless or more determined in his life. When it was time for Alexandra to go to the operating room, the twins kissed her cheeks with practiced bravery, whispering encouragements they'd clearly offered before. Maxwell approached last, leaning down to press his forehead gently against hers. "Fight," he whispered, the single word carrying the weight of 15 lost years and the promise of a future he was determined they would have. Alexandra nodded, her eyes clear and focused despite the medication beginning to take effect. "Take care of them," she whispered back, her gaze flickering to the twins. Maxwell nodded, a solemn vow he intended to keep regardless of the surgery's outcome. He stepped back, allowing the medical team to wheel Alexandra away, her small form disappearing through swinging doors that separated him from the woman he'd never truly stopped loving. The twins pressed closer to his sides, and he put his arms around them, these children who were suddenly the most important people in his world. The waiting room became their temporary home, its uncomfortable chairs and outdated magazines a backdrop to the most significant day of Maxwell's life. His assistant arrived with clothes for the twins, having correctly guessed their sizes, and food that went largely uneaten as anxiety suppressed their appetites. The hours stretched endlessly, marked only by the steady tick of the wall clock and occasional updates from nurses that told them nothing substantial. "The surgery is proceeding," was all they would say, their professional expressions revealing nothing of Alexandra's chances. Maxwell alternated between pacing the length of the waiting room and sitting with the twins, listening to them cautiously share small details of their lives. He learned that Thomas loved drawing and could spend hours creating detailed pictures of buildings he imagined. Maxwell recognized in this a reflection of his own early interest in architecture, before business had become his focus. Lily, he discovered, was passionately interested in science, collecting specimens and conducting simple experiments with whatever material she could find. Both children were remarkably intelligent, having taught themselves from library books when their formal education was interrupted by Alexandra's illness and financial struggles. Maxwell felt simultaneously proud of their resilience and devastated by the hardships they'd faced, hardships he could have prevented if only he'd known of their existence. As night fell, the twins eventually succumbed to exhaustion, curling up together on the waiting room couch like puppies seeking warmth and comfort from each other. Maxwell covered them with his suit jacket, watching their peaceful faces in sleep and marveling at how quickly they'd come to trust him. Or perhaps it wasn't trust yet, but necessity. He represented safety in a moment of crisis, and these children had learned to be practical above all else. Either way, he vowed silently that he would earn their trust completely, would become the father they deserved. His phone buzzed with messages from business associates wondering about his unexpected absence. But for the first time in 15 years, Maxwell Grant let his empire run without him. Some things, he was finally learning, were infinitely more important than money. Dawn was breaking when Dr. Reynolds finally emerged from the operating room, his surgical mask hanging around his neck, exhaustion evident in the lines of his face. Maxwell stood immediately, his heart pounding as he prepared himself for whatever news was coming. The surgeon approached slowly, and those few steps seemed to take an eternity. Maxwell searched the doctor's expression for clues, but years of medical practice had given Reynolds a perfect poker face. The twins stirred on the couch, as if sensing even in sleep that a crucial moment had arrived. Maxwell gently woke them, knowing they had every right to hear the news about their mother at the same moment he did. The surgery was successful, Dr. Reynolds said simply, and Maxwell felt his knees weaken with relief. We were able to remove the primary tumor and address the secondary sites. It was more extensive than we initially thought, but the experimental approach proved effective. He continued with medical details that Maxwell barely processed, focused only on the essential message: Alexandra would live. The twins were fully awake now, their faces transformed by a joy so pure that it brought tears to Maxwell's eyes. They hugged each other fiercely, then, in a move that surprised Maxwell, they threw their arms around his waist, including him in their celebration. The simple gesture of acceptance moved him more deeply than any business success ever had. "When can we see her?" Thomas asked, his usual solemnity momentarily forgotten in his excitement. Dr. Reynolds explained that Alexandra would be in recovery for several hours, and even then would be heavily sedated. "Tomorrow morning would be best," he advised, noting the exhaustion evident in all their faces. "She'll be more aware then, and you all need rest." Maxwell nodded, acknowledging the wisdom of this suggestion while already planning their accommodations for the night. They would not be returning to wherever the twins had been staying before, and his penthouse was across town, too far from the hospital for his comfort. As if reading his thoughts, his assistant appeared at his elbow. "I've reserved a suite at the hotel across the street," she informed him quietly. 3 bedrooms, with clothes and necessities for everyone. Maxwell thanked her with genuine gratitude, making a mental note to give her a substantial bonus for her initiative and discretion throughout this extraordinary day. The twins looked uncertain at the mention of a hotel, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of more charity, more debt they couldn't repay. Maxwell knelt down to their level, looking them in the eyes as equals. "Your mother needs to rest, and so do you," he said gently. "The hotel is close, so we can come back first thing in the morning. And I would very much like to get to know you both better." This last part was added with a vulnerability he rarely showed in his business dealings. But these weren't business associates. They were his children, and they deserved his honesty. After a moment's consideration, the twins nodded their agreement, their trust in him growing visibly with each passing hour. As they gathered their few belongings and prepared to leave the hospital temporarily, Maxwell was struck by how completely his life had changed in a single day. Yesterday morning, he had been a wealthy but lonely man, focused solely on expanding his business empire. Now he was a father, reconnected with the only woman he'd ever truly loved, his priorities rearranged entirely in the space of hours. The universe, it seemed, had plans for Maxwell Grant that far exceeded his own limited vision. The hotel suite was luxurious in a way that clearly intimidated the twins, who stepped carefully on the plush carpet as if afraid of leaving marks. Maxwell watched them take in the spaciousness, the elegant furniture, the fully stocked kitchen, all things he took for granted, but which represented an unimaginable change for children who had known only struggle. Lily approached the enormous windows cautiously, pressing her small hand against the glass as she looked out at the city lights spreading below them. Thomas examined the room service menu with wide eyes, clearly astounded by the prices listed for simple meals. Their reactions were a stark reminder of the disparity between Maxwell's world and the one they had known. "Are you hungry?" Maxwell asked, realizing they had barely eaten all day. The twins exchanged one of their communicative glances before Thomas nodded hesitantly. "We could share something small," he suggested, the caution of a child used to making resources stretch as far as possible. Maxwell felt his heart constrict at this evidence of their habitual self-denial. "Let's order a feast," he countered gently. "After today, I think we all deserve it." He picked up the phone and ordered a variety of dishes, making sure to include options that would appeal to children while avoiding asking them directly and putting them on the spot. Their discomfort with being catered to was evident, and he didn't want to increase it unnecessarily. While they waited for the food to arrive, Maxwell suggested they all get cleaned up. The assistant had arranged for new clothes to be waiting in each bedroom, simple but high-quality items in appropriate sizes. The twins accepted these offerings with a mixture of gratitude and confusion, clearly unaccustomed to receiving new things without strings attached. Maxwell showed them to their rooms, watching as they marveled at having individual spaces, each with its own bathroom. "Take your time," he told them gently. "There's plenty of hot water." The implication that this might not have been the case in their previous living situation hung unspoken between them. Maxwell used the time alone to make necessary calls, to his office, explaining his continued absence, to his lawyer, beginning the process of establishing his legal relationship to the twins, to his household staff, preparing them for the possibility of 2 new residents. When he emerged from his room, freshly showered and dressed in casual clothes rather than his usual business attire, he found the twins already waiting in the living area of the suite. They were transformed by their showers and new clothes, their resemblance to him even more striking now that layers of street dirt had been washed away. Thomas's hair, clean and combed, showed the same cowlick Maxwell had fought all his life. Lily's smile, tentative but genuine, was startlingly like his mother's. The food arrived, an abundance that clearly overwhelmed the twins despite their hunger. Maxwell served them, keeping his own portions modest to avoid making them self-conscious about their appetites. Slowly, as the meal progressed, the tension began to ease. Thomas ventured a question about the buildings Maxwell's company had designed, revealing an interest in architecture that went beyond simple drawing. Lily asked about the science behind the experimental procedure their mother had undergone, her intelligence evident in the thoughtfulness of her queries. Maxwell answered everything honestly, treating them as the capable individuals they were rather than as children to be sheltered from reality. By the time dessert arrived, a chocolate cake that drew genuine smiles from both twins, a tentative bond had begun to form between these 3 people connected by blood but strangers in experience. After dinner, Maxwell suggested they call the hospital for an update on Alexandra. The twins' faces lit up at the prospect, confirming his suspicion that regular communication with their mother was essential to their sense of security. The night nurse reported that Alexandra was stable, still sedated, but responding well to the immediate post-operative treatments. The relief on the twins' faces was palpable, and Maxwell realized how accustomed they were to bracing for bad news. Their resilience in the face of such uncertainty was both admirable and heartbreaking. No children should have to be so strong, so prepared for loss. He vowed silently that from now on, they would be allowed to simply be children with the ordinary concerns of their age. As the evening progressed, Maxwell noticed the twins fighting exhaustion, their eyelids growing heavy despite their determination to stay awake. He suggested gently that they get some rest, promising that tomorrow would bring a reunion with their mother and answers to the many questions that remained. Thomas resisted briefly, his protective instincts clearly making him reluctant to let down his guard in this unfamiliar environment. But Lily was already nodding off, her small body finally surrendering to the emotional and physical toll of the day. With a tenderness that surprised even himself, Maxwell lifted her gently and carried her to her room, Thomas following closely as if unwilling to let his sister out of his sight for even a moment. After tucking Lily into bed, Maxwell turned to find Thomas watching him with an evaluating gaze far too mature for his years. "You really didn't know about us?" the boy asked directly, his voice quiet but firm. Maxwell shook his head, holding his son's gaze steadily. "No, I didn't. If I had, I would have been there. Every day." The simple truth hung between them, both painful and healing in its acknowledgement of what had been lost. Thomas nodded slowly, accepting the answer. "Mom cried a lot when she looked at your picture," he offered, a child's way of confirming that the connection between his parents had been real, that his mother hadn't simply abandoned the idea of a complete family. "I missed her too," Maxwell admitted, the honesty feeling like a gift he could offer this solemn child. "I looked for her in the beginning, but she didn't want to be found." Thomas considered this, his young face contemplative. "She was scared," he said finally. "Not of you, of disappointing you." The insight was startling, revealing how carefully the twins had observed their mother over the years, how attuned they were to her unspoken emotions. Maxwell nodded, recognizing the truth in this assessment. Pride and fear had kept Alexandra away, the same pride that had likely made her resist seeking his help even when her illness threatened to leave the twins truly alone in the world. It was only as a last resort, facing mortality, that she had prepared them to find him. "Tomorrow will be a new beginning for all of us," Maxwell promised, reaching out cautiously to smooth Thomas's hair, half expecting the boy to pull away from this unfamiliar touch. But Thomas allowed it, and something in his guarded expression softened slightly. "Get some sleep," Maxwell encouraged. "I'll be right out here if you need anything." Thomas nodded, glancing once more at his sleeping sister before retreating to his own room. Maxwell returned to the suite's living area and sank onto the sofa, emotionally drained but more alive than he'd felt in years. The empty luxury of his life had been filled in an instant by two small people who needed him. Not his money or his influence, but him, their father. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through the suite's windows, illuminating the three people whose lives had been irrevocably intertwined by fate and a chance encounter. Maxwell, who had slept little, watching the door to the twins' rooms and processing the events of the previous day, was already dressed and had ordered breakfast when Thomas and Lily emerged from their rooms. They looked rested but anxious, clearly eager to return to the hospital and see their mother. Maxwell understood their urgency. He felt it himself. This need to confirm that Alexandra was truly recovering, that the miracle of finding his family wouldn't be snatched away as quickly as it had appeared. They ate quickly, the twins more comfortable with the abundance of food this morning, perhaps beginning to accept that such plenty might become their new normal. Maxwell watched them interact, fascinated by the silent communication they shared, the way they anticipated each other's needs without words. It reminded him of stories he'd heard about twins having special connections, but he suspected their bond had been strengthened by necessity, by having only each other to rely on during their mother's illness. He wondered if there would be room in that close circle for him, if they could eventually build the kind of trust that comes from shared experiences rather than mere biology. The hospital seemed different in the morning light, less intimidating somehow. The twins led the way to Alexandra's room with the confidence of children who had spent far too much time in medical facilities. A nurse stopped them briefly, updating Maxwell on Alexandra's condition before they entered. She had awakened earlier than expected, the nurse reported, and was asking for her children. The twins' faces lit up at this news, their steps quickening as they approached room 215. Maxwell followed more slowly, suddenly uncertain of his place in this reunion. Would Alexandra welcome his presence now that the immediate crisis had passed? Automated _ from Anthropic. Be sure to cite sources appropriately when using web search results. Would she regret having allowed him back into their lives when desperation gave her no other choice? These doubts vanished the moment they entered the room, and Alexandra's face brightened at the sight of all three of them together. Though pale and clearly weak, she was sitting up slightly, looking remarkably better than she had the previous day. The twins rushed to her bedside, their usual caution abandoned in their relief at seeing her awake and alert. Maxwell hung back, giving them this moment together, watching as Alexandra embraced her children with tears shining in her eyes. "Look at you both," she said softly, touching their clean faces and new clothes with wonder. "So handsome and beautiful." Her gaze lifted to Maxwell, gratitude and something deeper reflected in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, words that encompassed far more than the material improvements in the twins' appearance. Maxwell nodded, unable to speak past the emotion tightening his throat. He moved closer to the bed, drawn by an invisible thread that had never truly broken despite 15 years of separation. Alexandra's hand reached for his, and he took it, feeling the connection between them strengthen with this simple touch. The twins watched this interaction with cautious hope, their young faces revealing a longing for the family they had never known. Dr. Reynolds arrived shortly after, bringing with him detailed results from post-operative tests that confirmed the surgery's success. The cancer had been aggressive, he explained, but the experimental procedure had exceeded expectations. Alexandra would need further treatment, chemotherapy to ensure any remaining cancer cells were eliminated, but her prognosis was now guardedly optimistic rather than dire. Maxwell listened intently, mentally cataloging everything the doctor said, already planning how he would ensure Alexandra received the best possible care. The twins absorbed the information with the serious attention of children who had learned early to understand medical terminology, their hands clasped tightly together as they processed what this meant for their future. "When can she come home?" Lily asked, the question revealing both hope and anxiety. Dr. Reynolds considered the child with gentle respect, appreciating her direct approach. "Your mother will need to stay in the hospital for about a week," he explained. "Then she can continue her recovery at home, with regular visits to the hospital for follow-up treatments." The words hung in the air, raising the unspoken question of where exactly home would be. The twins glanced at each other, then at Maxwell, uncertainty clouding their expressions. Alexandra watched this exchange with a mixture of hope and apprehension, clearly wondering the same thing. Where would they go when she was released? Back to the struggling existence they had known, or into a new life with the father the twins had just met? Maxwell stepped forward, sensing the moment's importance. "I'd like all of you to come home with me," he said simply, addressing Alexandra directly but including the twins in his gaze. "My house has plenty of room, and you'll be close to the best medical facilities for your treatments." He paused, aware that he was offering more than practical arrangements. "If you want to, of course." Alexandra's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different from the fearful ones he'd seen yesterday. These spoke of relief, of burdens shared after being carried alone for too long. She nodded, unable to speak but communicating her acceptance of his offer. The twins looked between their parents, processing this development that would change their lives completely. "Is your house big?" Thomas asked, the practical question of a child trying to imagine a new reality. Maxwell smiled, grateful for the straightforward inquiry that broke the emotional tension in the room. "Yes, it's quite big," he admitted. "Too big, really, for just one person. It's on the water, with a garden where you can play." The twins exchanged glances, clearly trying to envision this description. "Do you have books?" Lily asked, her priorities revealing themselves. Maxwell nodded, remembering the extensive library that had been his main companion during lonely evenings. "Hundreds," he assured her. "And if there are any specific ones you want, we could get those too." The possibility seemed to delight her, a small smile lifting the corners of her mouth. As the morning progressed, a tentative plan took shape. Alexandra would focus on healing, while Maxwell made arrangements for their eventual move to his home. The twins would stay with him in the meantime, visiting their mother daily. It was a solution born of necessity, but one that offered the opportunity for bonds to form naturally. Alexandra requested time alone with Maxwell, while the twins went to the hospital cafeteria with one of the nurses who had befriended them. Once they were alone, she looked at him with clear eyes, the defensive pride that had kept her away for 7 years finally set aside. "I'm sorry," she said simply, "for not telling you, for making decisions that weren't just mine to make. You deserve to know your children, and they deserve to know you." Maxwell sat beside her bed, taking her hand in his. The anger he might have felt yesterday had dissolved in the face of nearly losing her, in the joy of discovering his children. "We can't change the past," he said gently, "but we can build something better for the future." Alexandra squeezed his hand weakly, tears tracking silently down her cheeks. Maxwell reached out to wipe them away, the gesture achingly familiar despite the years that separated them. "Why now?" he asked softly, the question that had been nagging at him since the twins first showed him the photograph. "Why were you finally ready for them to find me?" Alexandra's expression clouded with old pain and new determination, her strength remarkable even in her weakened state. "I was afraid I was going to die," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "The doctors told me my chances weren't good. I couldn't bear the thought of Thomas and Lily alone in the world, or lost in the system." She paused, gathering her strength for the difficult confession. "I've been watching your success from a distance all these years, seeing you build your company, change the skylines of cities around the world. I was proud of you, but it made me more certain I'd made the right choice. What place would there have been in that life for unexpected twins?" The question held no accusation, only the honest assessment of a woman who had made a heart-wrenching decision based on her understanding of the situation at the time. Maxwell shook his head, disagreeing with her conclusion but understanding how she had reached it. "There would have been every place for them," he said firmly. "And for you. Yes, I was driven, ambitious. But what was I building it all for, Alexandra? I've created this empire with no one to share it with, no purpose beyond the next acquisition, the next project." The admission cost him something, this acknowledgement of the emptiness at the heart of his success, but it felt right to offer her this truth. "Finding you again, discovering Thomas and Lily, it's like waking up from a 15-year dream and realizing what actually matters." Alexandra's eyes softened, her expression revealing that perhaps she had harbored the same realization during their years apart. "They're extraordinary children," she said, pride evident in her voice despite her exhaustion. "You'll see. Thomas can look at a building once and draw it perfectly later. Lily taught herself to read before she was 4, and she remembers everything she reads. They're both so much like you, determined, focused." Maxwell smiled, already having glimpsed these qualities in his brief time with the twins. "And like you," he countered gently, "they have your resilience, your heart." This exchange of parental pride felt natural, as if they had been sharing observations of their children for years rather than hours. It was a bridge across the chasm of their separation, the beginning of a new understanding between them. The conversation shifted to practical matters: Alexandra's treatment plan, the twins' education, which had been interrupted by financial hardship and her illness. Maxwell absorbed every detail, already formulating plans to address each challenge. They were deep in discussion when the twins returned, their cautious steps into the room suggesting they weren't entirely sure they weren't interrupting something important. Maxwell and Alexandra looked up simultaneously, both smiling in welcome, and the twins visibly relaxed at this unified response from their parents. It struck Maxwell then, the simple truth that had been obscured by years of separation and misunderstanding. They were a family, unconventional, newly reunited, still finding their way to each other, but unmistakably bound by ties stronger than circumstance. The week that followed established a new rhythm for all of them. Maxwell rearranged his schedule, delegating responsibilities that had once seemed crucial but now paled in comparison to the importance of being present for his newly discovered family. Mornings were spent at his penthouse with the twins, learning their routines and preferences, helping them adjust to the dramatic change in their circumstances. He discovered that Thomas was an early riser like himself, often already sketching building designs when Maxwell emerged from his room. Lily was more of a night owl, reading late and reluctant to wake in the mornings, a trait she apparently shared with Alexandra. These small revelations delighted Maxwell, these genetic echoes that connected them despite years of separation. Afternoons were devoted to hospital visits, the four of them gradually becoming comfortable as a unit. Alexandra grew stronger each day, her natural vivacity returning as the post-surgical pain subsided. The twins blossomed under the security of having both parents present, their usual caution slowly giving way to more typical childish behaviors. Occasional squabbles, spontaneous laughter, moments of unguarded joy that Maxwell found himself treasuring above all else. They were being allowed to be children again, rather than miniature adults burdened with concerns beyond their years. The transformation was both wonderful and heartbreaking, a reminder of what they should have had all along. Evenings became a time for planning the future, for careful conversations about expectations and hopes. Maxwell had his home renovated to create perfect spaces for the twins, consulting them about colors and furnishings, wanting them to feel ownership of their new environment. Alexandra was included in these discussions via video calls, her input valued as they created a home that would work for all of them. The question of what their relationship would be, whether Maxwell and Alexandra would attempt to recapture what they had lost or simply co-parent amicably, remained unspoken, both of them tacitly agreeing to focus on the twins' adjustment and Alexandra's recovery before addressing their own complicated feelings for each other. One evening, as Maxwell worked in his home office after the twins had gone to bed, he heard a soft knock at the door. Opening it, he found Thomas standing there in pajamas, clutching a sketchbook to his chest. "I couldn't sleep," the boy explained, his usual confidence momentarily replaced by uncertainty. Maxwell welcomed him in, clearing a space on his desk where Thomas could sit. For a while, they worked in companionable silence. Maxwell reviewing documents, Thomas drawing with the focused intensity that reminded Maxwell so much of himself at that age. Eventually, the boy slid his sketchbook over, revealing a detailed drawing of a house, larger and more elaborate than anything he'd shown Maxwell before. "I designed this for us," Thomas explained quietly, "for when Mom comes home." Maxwell studied the drawing with genuine admiration. The proportions were remarkably accurate for a child's work, the details thoughtful and purposeful. But it was the meaning behind the image that moved him most deeply. Thomas was planning for a future where they remained together, a family united after years of separation. "It's excellent," Maxwell said sincerely, his voice slightly rough with emotion. "Maybe we could build it someday." Thomas looked up at him with cautious hope. Clearly having expected a more non-committal response from his father, he was still getting to know. "Really?" Maxwell nodded, already mentally calculating how the design could be made structurally sound while preserving his son's vision. "Really? You have a gift, Thomas. And this," he tapped the drawing gently, "this is something special." The day of Alexandra's release from the hospital arrived with a sense of both celebration and nervous anticipation. The twins were particularly anxious, having spent years watching their mother struggle through illness and treatments, always bracing for the next setback. Maxwell had prepared everything meticulously. A comfortable room for Alexandra on the main floor to minimize stairs, a private nurse scheduled for the first few weeks, medications organized, follow-up appointments arranged with the best specialists. Yet underneath his efficient planning, he felt the same anxiety as the twins. This was the true beginning of their life together, without the structured environment of the hospital mediating their interactions. Would Alexandra feel overwhelmed by the luxury of his home? Would the twins settle into this new reality or long for the familiar, however difficult it had been? These concerns faded as they brought Alexandra home, her smile as she entered Maxwell's penthouse worth every moment of worry. She was still weak, still moved slowly with the caution of someone managing pain, but her eyes were bright with hope as she took in the space that would now be her home. The twins hovered close, watching for any sign of discomfort or distress, their protective instincts still firmly in place despite the dramatic improvement in their circumstances. Maxwell found himself doing the same, attuned to Alexandra's every expression in a way that reminded him of their early relationship, when he had been able to read her thoughts in the smallest change of her features. Some connections, it seemed, never truly faded, only lay dormant until reawakened by proximity. That evening, after Alexandra had rested and the twins had given her an enthusiastic tour of their new rooms, the four of them shared a quiet dinner together. It was their first meal as a family in their new home, a milestone that felt significant even without being acknowledged aloud. Maxwell had arranged for Alexandra's favorite foods, remembered from years ago, and was rewarded by her surprised delight at his thoughtfulness. The twins, picking up on the positive atmosphere, were more animated than usual, sharing stories from their week with Maxwell, describing their new school where they would start once everything was settled. Alexandra listened with tears shimmering in her eyes, clearly overwhelmed by the positive changes in her children's lives. Later, when the twins had gone to bed, Maxwell and Alexandra sat in the living room. The city lights spread before them through the floor-to-ceiling windows. They were silent for a while, absorbing the enormity of the transition they were navigating. "I keep expecting to wake up," Alexandra admitted softly, breaking the comfortable silence. Back in her old apartment, with the twins sleeping on the pull-out sofa, worrying about next month's rent and medical bills. Maxwell reached for her hand, understanding completely. His own life had changed just as dramatically, from solitary success to sudden fatherhood, from emotional emptiness to a home filled with the complicated, beautiful messiness of family life. "It's real," he assured her, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "And it's just the beginning." Alexandra turned to face him fully, her expression serious but open. "What happens next, Maxwell? Between us, I mean." The question hung in the air between them, unavoidable now that the immediate crises had been addressed. Maxwell considered his answer carefully, wanting to be honest without creating pressure on either of them. "I don't know," he admitted. 15 years is a long time. We're different people now." Alexandra nodded, acknowledging this truth. "But I do know that finding you again, meeting Thomas and Lily, it's changed everything for me. And I'd like to see where this goes, if you're willing." The words felt inadequate for the depth of emotion behind them, but they were a beginning, an opening rather than a demand. Alexandra's smile in response was like sunrise after a long night, tentative but unmistakably hopeful. The weeks that followed were a time of adjustments, of learning to live together as a family while navigating the complexities of their unusual situation. The twins started school, thriving in an environment that challenged their bright minds after years of interrupted education. Alexandra grew stronger daily, the combination of proper medical care and freedom for financial stress accelerating her recovery. Maxwell found himself delegating more responsibilities at work, surprising his executives with his new priorities, but discovering that his company functioned perfectly well without his constant presence. The life he had once defined entirely by professional success now centered around morning breakfast with his children, evening conversations with Alexandra, weekend outings that made up for years of missed family experiences. Not everything was smooth, of course. The twins occasionally tested boundaries, as all children do, pushing to see if this new stability could be trusted or if it might disappear as quickly as it had materialized. Thomas had moments of withdrawal, retreating into silence when emotions became too intense. Lily sometimes woke with nightmares, calling for her mother with a panic that revealed the depth of her fears about potentially losing her. Alexandra struggled with accepting help after years of fierce independence, sometimes bristling at Maxwell's well-intentioned efforts to make her life easier. Maxwell himself had to learn patience, to set aside the businessman's expectation of immediate results and embrace the messier, more gradual process of building family relationships. Through it all, an undeniable bond was forming between the four of them. It wasn't the traditional family structure that might have developed had they been together from the beginning, but something equally valuable, a family forged through challenge and choice rather than mere circumstance. The twins began to turn to Maxwell for guidance as readily as they did to Alexandra, sharing their interests and concerns with growing trust. Alexandra and Maxwell found themselves naturally partnering in parenting decisions, their different strengths complementing each other in ways that benefited their children. And beneath the practical cooperation of co-parenting, their personal connection was cautiously rekindling, built on a foundation of shared history, but growing into something new that honored the people they had become. One Sunday morning, about 2 months after Alexandra had come home from the hospital, Maxwell woke early as usual. The penthouse was quiet, the twins and Alexandra still sleeping as he made coffee and watched the sunrise over the city. He found himself reflecting on the whirlwind that had transformed his life since that chance encounter with 2 barefoot children on a downtown sidewalk. Every aspect of his existence had changed. His daily routines, his priorities, his understanding of what constituted success. The man who had once measured his worth by buildings constructed and deals closed now found his greatest satisfaction in Thomas's proud smile when he mastered a difficult math concept, or Lily's delighted laugh when she discovered a new book, or Alexandra's quiet contentment as she regained her strength and began planning a future she had once feared she wouldn't live to see. Maxwell was lost in these thoughts when he felt a presence beside him. Alexandra had woken early for once, joining him at the window with her own cup of coffee. She looked beautiful in the morning light, her health returning visibly with each passing week. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked softly, mindful of the still sleeping twins. Maxwell smiled, turning to face her. "I was just thinking about coincidences," he admitted. "If my driver hadn't taken that wrong turn, if the twins hadn't been on that particular street corner, if I hadn't felt compelled to stop." He shook his head, still amazed by the chain of seemingly random events that had led to this moment. Alexandra considered this, her expression thoughtful as she sipped her coffee. "Maybe it wasn't coincidence," she suggested. "Maybe some connections are meant to be found, no matter how many detours we take along the way." The idea resonated with Maxwell, offering a comforting perspective on the years they had lost. Perhaps those years hadn't been wasted, but had prepared them all for this reunion, this second chance at being a family. He was about to respond when the twins appeared, still in pajamas, drawn by the voices of their parents. Thomas was carrying the sketchbook that rarely left his side, while Lily clutched a novel she'd been reading before bed. They joined the adults by the window, the four of them watching the city wake up together in a moment of peaceful unity that would have seemed impossible just months ago. Maxwell felt Alexandra's hand slip into his, a gesture that had become more frequent lately as they navigated the transition from co-parents to something more. The twins noticed, exchanging small smiles that revealed their approval of this development. Later that day, as autumn sunshine warmed the penthouse, Maxwell found himself alone with Alexandra while the twins worked on school projects in their rooms. They sat together on the balcony, enjoying the rare moment of quiet in a household that had become pleasantly busy with the routines and minor crises of family life. "The kids seem happy," Alexandra observed, her voice carrying a note of wonder that hadn't faded despite the weeks of improved circumstances. Maxwell nodded, sharing her amazement at how resilient children could be, how readily Thomas and Lily had adapted to their new reality once they trusted it wouldn't be snatched away. "They're extraordinary," he agreed. "But then, they had an extraordinary mother who raised them through impossible circumstances." Alexandra accepted the compliment with a small smile, though Maxwell detected a shadow crossing her features. "What's wrong?" he asked gently, having learned to read her expressions again during their time together. She hesitated, clearly weighing whether to share whatever was troubling her. "I've been offered a job," she finally said, "at the Children's Hospital, using my nursing degree again, working with families facing serious illnesses." The news was unexpected, but made perfect sense. Alexandra had always been compassionate, and her own experience gave her unique insight into what those families were enduring. "That's wonderful," Maxwell said sincerely, but he sensed there was more she wasn't saying. "But," he prompted softly, "but I'm afraid," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid of pushing too hard, too soon. Afraid of independence after depending on you these past months." She looked up at him, her expression vulnerable in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. "Afraid of what it means for us, for this careful balance we've created." Maxwell understood immediately. They had been rebuilding their relationship within the safe boundaries of their shared focus on the twins and her recovery. Her returning to work represented a shift, a step toward the unknown territory of defining their relationship on its own terms rather than through the lens of parenthood or illness. It was frightening, but also necessary if they were to build something lasting. "Take the job," Maxwell encouraged, reaching for her hand. "You've always been strongest when helping others. It's one of the things I've always loved about you." The use of the present tense wasn't lost on either of them, a quiet acknowledgement of feelings that had survived 15 years of separation. "As for us, we'll figure it out. One day at a time." Alexandra's fingers intertwined with his, her grip firm despite her lingering physical weakness. "One day at a time," she repeated, the simple phrase somehow containing a promise for the future that neither of them was quite ready to articulate more explicitly. From inside the penthouse came the sound of the twins laughing, the joyful noise of children secure in their world. Maxwell and Alexandra shared a smile, both understanding that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as the family they were always meant to be. 6 months after the day Maxwell had given a coin to 2 barefoot twins on a downtown street corner, the Grant family stood together on the beach outside their new home. It wasn't the penthouse where they had initially settled, but a spacious house by the ocean, designed with input from all 4 of them, but especially incorporating elements from Thomas's original sketch. Maxwell had built it not as a showcase of wealth, but as a true home, a place where his children could run freely and Alexandra could garden as she'd always loved to do. The twins raced along the shoreline, their laughter carried on the salt breeze, while Maxwell and Alexandra watched from the patio, their hands naturally finding each other as had become their habit. "They're going to sleep well tonight," Alexandra observed, smiling as Lily splashed water at her brother, who pretended outrage before chasing her down the beach. Both children were transformed from the cautious, solemn pair Maxwell had first encountered. They were still thoughtful, still remarkably mature in many ways, but they had rediscovered the simple joy of being children, secure in the knowledge that their parents were watching out for them. Alexandra, too, had blossomed, her strength fully returned, her work at the hospital fulfilling her in ways that complemented her role as a mother. The haunted look that had shadowed her eyes in the hospital had been replaced by a quiet contentment, a peace that came from knowing her children were thriving and her own future was no longer limited by illness and financial struggle. And Maxwell, he had changed perhaps the most profoundly of all. The driven businessman still existed. He continued to lead his company, to make decisions that shaped skylines around the world, but those achievements no longer defined him. Success had taken on new meaning. Thomas mastering a complicated architectural concept under his guidance, Lily asking for his opinion on a science project, Alexandra's smile when he returned home each evening. The emptiness that had accompanied his material success for 15 years had been filled by something no amount of money could have purchased. The love of the family that was his not through obligation, but through choice, through the daily decisions they all made to build a life together despite the years that had separated them. "Do you ever think about that day?" Alexandra asked softly, her gaze still on the twins, but her thoughts clearly turning to the chance encounter that had reunited them. "The coincidence of it all still amazes me sometimes." Maxwell considered the question, remembering his confusion when the twins had mentioned the man from the photo, the shock of recognition when he'd seen Alexandra's picture, the life-changing hours that followed. But his perspective had shifted over these months together. What had once seemed like random chance now felt like something more meaningful, more intentional. "I don't think it was coincidence," he said finally. putting words to the feeling that had grown stronger with time. I think it was finding our way back to where we were always meant to be. Alexandra turned to him, her expression softening with an emotion that neither of them feared naming anymore. Home, she said simply, the word encompassing far more than the beautiful house behind them or the beach where their children played. Home was found in the four of them together, in the bonds that had proven stronger than time or circumstance or misunderstanding. Maxwell nodded, drawing her closer as they watched the twins racing back toward them, faces alight with excitement about something they discovered at the water's edge. Whatever it was, a unique shell, an interesting piece of driftwood, it would be received with genuine interest, added to the collection of treasures that marked their new life together. Because that was what family meant, finding value in the small moments, the shared discoveries, the journey of growing together day by day. And as the twins reached them, breathless and eager to share their latest find, Maxwell knew with absolute certainty that the true wealth in his life had nothing to do with the fortune he'd amassed and everything to do with the three people who had transformed his existence from success to significance. As our story comes to an end, I invite you to reflect on the powerful message it carries. Life's most meaningful connections often come when we least expect them, sometimes from a simple act of kindness or a moment of recognition that changes everything. Maxwell's journey from isolated success to meaningful family bonds reminds us that true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts or buildings, but in the relationships we nurture and the love we share. What coincidences in your own life might actually be pointing you towards something more meaningful? Have you been focused on building a life that looks successful from the outside, while missing the connections that could fill it with purpose? Perhaps there are relationships in your own past that deserve a second chance, bridges that could be rebuilt with courage and humility. The transformation we witnessed in Thomas and Lily shows us the incredible resilience of the human spirit, especially in children. When given security, love, and the freedom to simply be children, they blossomed. This raises an important question. How might we contribute to creating that sense of safety and belonging for the vulnerable people in our own communities? Alexandra's journey reminds us that pride and fear often keep us from reaching out when we need help the most. Her eventual willingness to reconnect with Maxwell not only saved her life, but created the possibility of healing for an entire family. What might be possible in your life if you set aside pride and embraced vulnerability? This story touches something deep within us because it speaks to universal truths about human connection, forgiveness, and second chances. We all yearn for meaning, for belonging, for the feeling that we are exactly where we're meant to be. Sometimes finding that place requires a detour, a wrong turn that ultimately leads us right where we need to go. I encourage you to carry this story with you as inspiration to remain open to unexpected connections and to value the true wealth of meaningful relationships in your own life. If something in this narrative resonated with you, perhaps it's a sign that your own heart is calling you toward deeper connections or healing of past wounds. If you found value in this story and would like to explore more narratives that inspire and touch the heart, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Your engagement through likes, comments, and shares helps us continue creating content that reminds us all of what truly matters in life. What part of Maxwell and Alexandra's journey spoke most deeply to you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective might be exactly what another viewer needs to hear today. Remember, sometimes life's wrong turns lead us to exactly where we're meant to be. Thank you for joining me on this journey.